programming, as we've been dealing with for the last 2 weeks. For topic 1, we're going to work on gathering data using classes. Now, we already did a module topic that included file I/O, being able to pull in data into a Python program or writing it out to a file. For this specific one, we're going to be utilizing a CSV file, which is a little bit different than what we did before, and we're going to be utilizing that data we're inputting through object-oriented programming, where we're going to create a class, and then objects, an object in this case, will be created using that information. So first we're going to learn how to import. CSV file, if you don't know, it's a file format that can be used by a lot of different applications because it is a commonly known file format. It allows you to transfer data from one program to another really easily. And CSV literally stands for comma separated values. So what you end up with is you end up with a series of rows, and each row has pieces of information, and each of those pieces of information is separated by a comma. You could very easily, a common way to look at them is in a spreadsheet because they fit well to that structure. We're going to be messing around with some weather data that I gathered a while back to do some interesting stuff here. So here's a view of the data. You can see I've got a date column, a max temperature for that date, a minimum temperature for that date, average temperature for that date, precipitation for that date, and new snow for that date. Pretty common piece of information here, nothing real crazy. If you wanted to look at it in a normal CSV format, you can see I've got it here. Again, it's got a header row first that gives a label for each one of the pieces of information in each row, and then it just continues down. Each new line is a new piece of information or a grouping of information. So you can see every row has a date, max temperature, min temperature, average temperature, precipitation, and snow. It's all the rows, all of the rows have to have the same number of columns in it for this to work properly. So first thing is just generally, how would you pull this into a program? This is kind of a throwaway cell, but just to show you importing this information. So you can see the first thing you have to do is you have to import CSV. It's a module that comes installed with Python, but it's not automatically included when you run your program. So you have to just do that import first. So I'm going to import CSV. And then it's very similar to what we saw with file I/O. So I'm going to do the with open. I'm going to say what file I want to import. I have this file in the same directory as my Python program. That's why I don't have any file directory rigmarole that I have to deal with here. I'm just saying the name of the file. And then I'm going to cast it as CSV file to make my code a little bit easier to read. And you can see here, I've got a variable called CSV reader, and it is going to read this CSV file. And then I'm just going to throw in this line count equals 0, because what I want to do is, as I'm importing my data into Python, I don't want to import that first line of information as if it is data, because we know that it is headers, it is not actual data. So it can mess up your output or your results of your program if you include a row that isn't actually appropriate data. So you can see for row in CSV reader, so it's going to do this bit of code here for each row it finds in the file. I'm going to say, hey, if that line count is 0, then just I'm going to just do a simple print statement here and then go to the next line. And if it's more than 1 or 0, it'll skip this first part and do the else. And so in this case, I'm just printing the row and then incrementing the line. And then once it's done with the entire file, it says process so many lines. So if I run this, you can see that I have all of the data available in my program. I didn't really save it to any variables or anything here. I'm just showing that I can pull it into the program. You can see this is the information that I included when I read from the first row, and then each one of the other rows is just printed very nicely in it's already set up in a list. The thing you want to note here is every one of the items in this list are considered strings. So just like when you import from a file, importing from a CSV file, Python just treats everything that it brings in as a string. So that's that. So that's just a very simple import. Now we're going to do something a little more interesting with it. So we know how to import into our program. Let's do something with object-oriented programming here. So we're going to create a class, and then we're going to import data into an object of that class. So one of my fancy UML diagrams that we've been seeing the last few weeks, I'm going to create one called City Weather Data is the name of the class, and it's going to have attributes of date, date max temp, date min temp, date average temp, date precipitation, and date new snow. You can see all of these are going to be of type list because I'm going to have multiple days worth of data. So each one of those items will be an item in the list. And then I've got two methods that I'm doing. This is a little confusing to read, but it's the maximum max temperature week and the minimum max temperature week. So what I want to do with these methods is I want to determine in the date range that I gathered for this analysis, which 7-day period had the highest maximum average temperature. So, if I had 7 days and all 7 days were 1 degree, the average for those 7 days would be 1 degree. But if I go 1 day later and that last day is now 2 degrees, well, that's going to be a little bit warmer on the average than the first 7. So that would become then the maximum. You'll see as I step through this. But continue on. So I've got that. That's the class I'm going to make. And this is that data that I'm utilizing again. And you can see I just highlighted it. Each one of these items, these columns, is going to become its own list in my class object. So that just highlighted that way. Another way to look at it is each one of these is going to get pointed at an attribute of my class when I create my object. And this is yet another way to look at it. And I guess I went a bit overboard there. Okay, so this code that I'm doing here is going to utilize an ordered dict data type. When I introduced dictionaries, I mentioned this prior to Python 3.5, I believe it was. Dictionaries were not considered ordered collections. If you loaded a bunch of data into a dictionary and then you tried to pop it off the dictionary or utilize a dictionary item at a certain index, you could not guarantee that it would come back in the same order that you put it into the list or into the dictionary. So for older versions of Python, you needed to use what's called an ordered dict data type to ensure that it kept that order. And because of the way I'm doing my analysis here or my work here, I needed to make sure that this dictionary was in a certain order. So I utilized an ordered dict. It is a bit overboard because I'm running Python 3.7. So in Python 3.7, I already know that my dictionary, a regular dictionary, would maintain that order that it was created with. But if I wanted to include ordered dictionary, I would need to use the collections module and import ordered dict from that module. And this is my class. You can see here I've got class city weather data, and I've got all the attributes of my class. Nothing should be new here, right? I've got my date, my max temp, min temp. These are all things we've done with object-oriented programming from our first week of it a couple weeks ago. And then I've got two methods here. I'm going to step you through these methods because this can get a little bit hairy. And this is part of the reason I picked a more complex example is because I know a lot of the stuff we've been doing is fairly simple, but it can get a little more complex. This is something that me just reading it to you, it may not click right away, but if you were to take this code, which obviously you have access to, and step through it yourself, I think it'll start to gel for you and make a little more sense. But I'm going to step through it nonetheless. So first I'm creating my ordered dictionary. So when you create an ordered dictionary, this is the syntax you have to use. You can't just use the squiggly brackets to create an empty dictionary. You have to do it like this. So now I've got an empty ordered dictionary. And then I'm just initializing a couple of variables here. Sum of temps, I'm starting at 0. Date list, I'm creating an empty date list, and I'm creating an empty temp list. Now, again, none of this does anything until I create my objects and import my data. However, this is the class information. So I have to go first through a for loop for the length of self.date. So I don't know how many dates are going to be in the list that is brought in. So I need to know the full length of that list. So I'm going to use length of the date list field to know how many times I need to iterate. And I'm going to take that information and I'm going to create something called date max, or I'm going to load up date max temp dictionary, that ordered dictionary that I created. And I'm going to have a key of the date, and the index is going to be, I'm going to utilize self.date for the index position in the list where that date is. and it's going to bring in that. So the value of that is going to be the date's max temperature. So all I'm doing here is I'm going to grab the first item off of the list, and that date is going to be the key, and then I'm going to grab the first item on the max temperature, and that's going to be the first item or value in the dictionary. So I end up with date max temp, date max temp, date max temp. That's what my dictionary ends up looking like. So once it's gone through the entire thing and loaded up this temporary dictionary, or this max temp dictionary, now I can utilize that to determine my max temperature. So you can see for KV in that dictionary items. So remember, K and V is two values, the key and the value. I'm utilizing both of them here. I'm going to create a date list. I'm going to append to my date list, my empty date list that already exists. I'm going to append the key value, which is the date, and to temperature list, I'm going to append the value, which is the temperature. So I end up with two lists here, and then I have to load up, or I have to determine if I have 7 dates. So when I first start this, the first time around, I'm only going to have 1 date and 1 temperature. I can't do an analysis on this. I have to make sure that I have 7 in there to try to figure out what the average temperature is for that 7-day range. So until I have 7 items in my lists, I just keep going through this if. So I say, hey, if it's not greater or equal to 7, I'm going to skip that part. If it's equal to 7, I'm going to do this part. But if it's less than 7, I'm just going to go back up here again, right? So on the first iteration, I add an item to the date list and the temp list, and then I go right back to the beginning. Second time, I add another item to the date list and the temp list, and then I go right back to the beginning again. Then the third one, I add another item and date and temperature. Until I have 7, then I get to this part where now, hey, it meets this criteria, and then it's going to check. So I've got 7 items in my list. If I wanted to look at this another way, I could do this. I could say, on first iteration, all I have is this, which isn't enough to do an analysis. And then the second time I can do this, or I have these 2, right? I have 2 items in my list. The third time, or I'm sorry, it's a dictionary. Well, it's 2 lists from a dictionary. The third time I have 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7. Once I finally have 7, now I can figure out what the average maximum temperature is across that 7-day period. So that's where I do this. So I say, if the sum of temperature list divided by 7 is greater than sum temps, which the first time around I have sum temps at 0. So as long as I'm not, in the Arctic Circle where it's always below 0, my first iteration is going to surely be greater than 7 on average, or 0 on average. Then sum temps becomes the new average temperature. So it says, hey, if across the 7 days the average was 50 degrees, well, 50 degrees is greater than 0, then the new sum temperature, or our average sum temperature, becomes that new temperature. And then I say, and I'm also stating what I'm storing, what day that started and what day that ended. So I know what the 7-day period is, and I know what the maximum average of temperature is. And then once I've done that, I need to drop the first item off the list because I've finished my analysis on that 7-day period. Now what I need to do, I'm looking at this again. So here's my 7-day period. I'm done with this analysis. Now I need to drop this first pair, and I need to do the 2nd through the 8th day period. So now I need to check the average temperature here. And then once I've done that, I need to check the average temperature in the next 7-day period. And then after that, I need to check the average temperature in the next 7-day period. And I do this over and over and over until I get to the very end of the list. And each time that I find that the average maximum temperature in that 7-day period is greater than what I already consider to be the maximum temperature, then that becomes the new maximum temperature. So once I've iterated over the entire thing, what I end up with is the 7-day period with the highest average temperature. So once all of this completes and I get to the very end, I return my result. So that's how that one works. The minimum max temperature week works exactly the same way, except it takes a different value. It takes that column that's the minimum max temp instead of the maximum max temp. So it's essentially the same code repeated. And if I run this, nothing will happen because this is just creating my class. I can move on now to creating objects from it. So you can ignore these next two things. I was going to try to do this in the presentation mode, but it just wasn't going to work, so I just skipped that. Continuing on, this is another visual showing that date max temperature dictionary is loading it into a date list and a temperature list. This is what I've already said verbally, it's just a visual of it. And then you can see I end up with 7 days or 7 items in each one of the lists that I can use for my analysis. So we have our class, we have our methods. Let's instantiate our new object. So the only weather data I have in this case is for Des Moines. If I had only ever wanted to do Des Moines weather maximum, what I'm doing here with object-oriented doesn't really make a lot of sense because I could have just done it with regular code. However, once I've created this class and objects, I could create an object for every city I come across, however many dates I have, and as long as I can load the date and the temperature, I can utilize this same code. I can create an object for Ankeny, or I can create an object for New York City if I wanted to, and then load in that data and it would work exactly the same. That's one of the beautiful things about classes and objects is I've got a blueprint created and I can use it over and over again. But in this case, I just have Des Moines. So first I'm going to do that import that I showed you before, except I'm going to do it in a more meaningful way here. So again, import CSV. I'm going to do the with open on that file. Again, I'm casting it with CSV file as a name, or aliasing it with CSV file. And then I'm going to do the reader. I'm telling it specifically I have a delimiter of comma to make sure that it knows the correct delimitation. Comma is very typical. There are other ones that are also used. Tab delimited is very common. Sometimes like a bar delimited or any number of characters can be used for your delimiter. The thing that usually affects what you use for a delimiter is what's in the actual data. If you have a data with a lot of commas in it and it's not properly escaped or quoted around, sometimes people will avoid commas because it can mess up the file. So, but in this case, it's a CSV with comma delimiter. And again, I'm initializing that line comment 0. And then this is just a shortcut. Again, this was done because I wanted to try to get it all on one screen in the other view. But just so you know, you can do this way, and sometimes you'll see people do this. Sometimes I consider it a little bit of showing off. But what I'm doing here is I'm initializing 6 different lists, empty lists, all on the same line using this empty list for I in range 6. So I could have just as easily said date equals bracket and bracket, or bracket and bracket. On the next line, do max temp equals bracket and bracket. Next line, min temp equals bracket and bracket. It's the exact same thing. It's just done on all one line. So I've got my empty lists. Now I need to load them up for my CSV file. So I'm saying for each row in the CSV reader, first of all, skipping that first line, just like we did before, because I don't want to pull in the headers. I'm going to, I'm starting on the second row, I'm going to append to my first item, my list, or my date list, I'm going to append row 0. So what this is saying is, give me the first item in the row, so index 0 is the first item in the row, and append it to my date list. And then going to the next item in the row. So if I were to look at this from an Excel spreadsheet point of view, at first saying, give me this item and append it to my date list. Then give me this item, index 1, and append it to my max temp list. Then do the same thing for min temp, average temp, etc., etc., etc. So that file's not exact because I've got some extra columns in there, I see now, but it's very similar. So I can grab each one of the items in the row and load it to the appropriate list. So in the end, I end up with 6 different lists that I can utilize in my code. Now, I only really use, in this case, these 3 because I didn't bother to build all the rest, but all that data is there. So, and then once I've got that done, I'm going to create my Des Moines object. So I'm going to create an object called, a variable called Des Moines of type city weather data, and I'm going to load it up with all of those lists that I just imported. So that's done now. And then I'm going to just go ahead and print Des Moines so you can see that I have this object created. I didn't bother to create my str, so it just shows me the object, but I do know, I can see that the object has been created. And then I can run my methods. So all that work I did now very simply just boils down to, hey, give me the max temperature week in the data and give me the min max temperature week in the data using these two methods. And you can see that the maximum max temperature was 92 degrees from the dates of July 14th to July 20th, and the minimum maximum temperature is 17 degrees from January 25th to January 31st. So again, I could use this for any data I bring in and get this same kind of output. I just create objects and then I utilize those methods to go along with it. So again, as I said at the beginning, this is a more complex example. It is worth taking the time to step through to get familiar with it. It's kind of fun, to try to solve these more complex problems. So